Hello, everyone. I'm warmly welcoming you to our the kickoff event of our two-day webinar series here at RSIS on post-pandemic recovery across the world's regions. A very warm welcome to you all. I'm your moderator for today, Ferre Klim. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Multilateralism Studies here at RSIS in Singapore. So today, and actually the following Friday, we will try to take stock of the state of multilateralism worldwide. We will assess how multilateral cooperation has been affected by nearly 2 years, over 2 years of pandemic and just amid other uncertainties. And I guess hopes of a quickly subsiding pandemic following the vaccine rollout in late 2020 have been largely disappointed, I guess, to some extent. And this is only one among many other challenges to smooth multilateralism of late. And at the Center for Multilateralism Studies, of course, multilateralism is our bread and butter. And we will look at our region and beyond to understand how the major regions of this world have responded to the crisis, its economic and many other effects. We will also ask what new issues perhaps are emerging on the horizon in the respective region as each region grapples with some sort of the new normal, trying to regain some sort of sense of normality and managing multilateralism and interstate cooperation in this new normal. We want to understand how they are coping with these challenges, how they are coping with related issues. And we do, of course, have an ulterior motive here, right? We want to learn from different regional experiences. We want to draw lessons for ASEAN, for Southeast Asia, for Singapore, of course, right? So before we zoom out into the wider world, I guess, next week, for this first edition, we will look much closer to home, right? We will look at East Asia, South Asia, and Australia and the Pacific. And to this end, I have picked up my imaginary Zoom telephone and I rang some of our friends across the region. Looking at Southeast Asia and ASEAN for us will be Dr. Fitriani. And Fitri is a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at CSIS Indonesia, whose knowledge of Southeast Asia and multilateralism in this region is second to none. A bit further afield, I guess the wider East Asia, is Associate Professor Tomo Kikuchi, and he is a good friend of RSIS, former resident and now adjunct fellow with us. And he's in full time at Waseda University's Graduate School of Asia-Pacific Studies in Tokyo. And his particular deep insights into economics, especially in East Asia, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and so forth, will help us today to make sense of what's going on there. Looking at South Asia is our very own Dr. Sindapal Singh. He is a senior fellow and coordinator of our South Asia program here at RSIS. And his expert understanding of international relations of South Asia will help us see how that region in the Indo-Pacific is doing. Furthest afield today for Australia and the Pacific region is Dr. Tess Newton-Kane. She's adjunct professor and project leader for the Pacific Hub at Griffith Asia Institute in Australia. And those of you who have studied an earlier version of the program will note that there is a minor change here on that end, but we are absolutely delighted to have Tess with us today representing Griffith Asia, not least because Tess, of course, has a deep understanding of Australia, but specifically of regionalism in the South Pacific. And some of you will know that Singapore has just become formally admitted as the latest dialogue partner, I think they call it, to the Pacific Islands Forum. So how timely to get a better understanding of the southern sub-region in the Asia Pacific. So without much further hot air from my side, I will ask all our guests here in the audience, in the virtual audience, to begin typing their question as they feel it during the presentation. The bottom of the screen, please use the Q&A function. And I hand over to our first speaker, who I understand has some extreme weather conditions outside her window. So let's hope her connection stays stable, and we will try our very best. So, Fitri, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fred, for your very kind introduction. Yeah, what do you want me to share? I wish that the vaccinated travel lanes are already going and I can like fly there and give the talk in person. It will be better. Singapore has the best internet infrastructure in the whole Southeast Asia. So I will begin my 2 cents about what lesson that the ASEAN in this region. I thought we are gonna do this as a panel discussion that you're gonna ask me questions. So if not, I will just give sort of what my take on how the ASEAN the handling of COVID pandemic. The region Southeast Asia deals it and learn from how the previously the global infrastructure condition was very competitive between the US and China, and we learned that blaming and looking for where the virus are from is not productive or resulted to anything. And we see that multilateralism regional organization is a platform which member state can create collective strategy to combat the virus. Each regional organization usually mostly quick to band together their ability or capacity fund to recover and provide some sort of aid framework. Similar ways also being taken by ASEAN that has also quick to have a meeting, virtual meeting to discuss common concern and strategy to move forward in addressing the pandemic, as well as utilizing the network of ASEAN, wider ASEAN +3 framework with the collaboration of China, Japan, and South Korea that at a time we see has been successful in addressing the health impact of the pandemic. Every regional organization have their own forte, and the way they do it have differing ways. How ASEAN do it, we do it in a way that is formal relatively. It is handled through the crisis management way, and I argue it's able to prevent the crisis to grow into conflict, despite the border has been closed. 9 out of 10 countries are closing its border, and the lockdown has been implemented at least in the beginning to 5 countries out of 10 ASEAN countries. But the ASEAN conduct ASEAN Summit on COVID-19, the mechanism of ASEAN Health Ministerial Meeting, and a formal approach in dealing with the pandemic, including having ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, ASEAN Response Fund, ASEAN Regional Reserve of Medical Supplies for public health emergencies, and formulated standard operating procedures for health emergencies. Now, I want to know whether is there any specific part, Fred, that you want me to explain, because I don't want to be boring and not addressing your question, because there is quite a lot of question that I can go to.
Yeah, no. That's great, Fitri. Perhaps I think you mentioned the indirectly you mentioned the ASEAN plus 3 process, right? So you mentioned that this kind of helped Southeast Asia engaging with the wider East Asian region. Perhaps is there anything that you can feel here from your perspective here in Southeast Asia? You can see any concrete deliverables? And the same question: can you see any concrete deliverables from ASEAN within the ASEAN 10, right? Is there anything that in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, perhaps your own experience would tell you, okay, here is really where cooperation within ASEAN on pandemic management has really made a difference to us here on the ground. It has actually, perhaps in both ways, right? It has either hindered successful pandemic management in Indonesia or any other country in Southeast Asia, or it has actually helped. Is there anything you can elaborate on this, perhaps?
Thank you. Yes, I think having that cooperation, and then at the time we really are in need in terms of fund to support the health assistance, to provide enough tests back, to provide then a subsequently vaccine. It has the cooperation of ASEAN +3 have supported ASEAN greatly. In terms of what ASEAN itself responds to the pandemic, the region has been greatly focused or greatly receiving income from tourism, for example, and agriculture, and those kind of activities has been hampered by the pandemic, especially the cross-border migrant worker that are actually working in a plantation, and that has been hampered. And then therefore the cooperation within the ASEAN and the mechanism that being discussed has been tremendously help how each of the ASEAN countries can support each other in dealing with the pandemic. So the utmost concern for ASEAN member state is at the time until now is really to ensure the market remains open, the trade flow continues, and the supply chain connectivity persisted. And therefore, having that support from the ASEAN within ASEAN itself, the 10 ASEAN countries, as well as the big ASEAN countries that you mentioned, Indonesia, to move the discussion forward, to keep on calling, despite we have internal issues, conflict within. But we keep on focusing on what we can do, and then collaboration within ASEAN +3. And as I mentioned before, tourism, manufacturing, and agriculture sector were the greatest concern, or are the greatest concern of the ASEAN member state throughout the pandemic. And it has been an issue being discussed in the ASEAN summit, special summit, and commitment has been made. And what has been actually put forward is, despite the border closing and competition or conflict that is quite abound sub-regionally, there are regional commitment to the principle of market openness, continued trade flow, supply chain connectivity, to not resort to protectionism. Sorry, my English is not my first language. Therefore, there is plan of action being adopted in strengthening the economic cooperation and supply chain connectivity, for example, that has been arguably disturbed by the pandemic. You were mentioning, Fred, about the silver lining, right? Is there any other new issues that has been, set going on? Can you repeat the question at that time?
Yeah, you see here at RSIS, we love to finish on a positive note. So if you perhaps could say, could sum up for us, what is the feeling in Southeast Asia and ASEAN in terms of silver lining, right? What is there? Has the silver lining faded entirely? Is it all doom and gloom, or is there anything we can look forward to here in the immediate future here in terms of multilateralism and pandemic management?
I think ASEAN has been doing quite well. That we, from the last ASEAN Summit statement, there is actually a call to have equitable distribution of vaccine, and the call for ASEAN Fund to support that action. In terms of other silver lining, besides the health, addressing the health concern, addressing the economic concern that I already touched upon, the other silver lining or new issues that has been seen in ASEAN is how fast is the society can go online, despite the different level of internet infrastructure. And there's, people said, the digital gap, so on and so forth. We see this limited mobility have been pushed people to go to online meeting platform and have technological advancement, that discussion has been, been more welcome, especially by countries that previously a bit resistant in discussing about cybersecurity. And now the discussion has been moved to enhancing digital skill for the community, digital skill for education, digitalizing economy, education, and to a certain way, a health system that is very important when it comes to pandemic. So we also see this push for digitalization. We see how the government of Southeast Asia, that was kind of traditional, has been pushed themselves to service the people digitally, and have they need to be aware of the discussion global, and try to make themselves relevant and look for ways on maintaining their traditional income, as I mentioned before, the tourism industry, how to make those businesses digital. So that the COVID situation, because you said this, I should stop because maybe I talk too much. The COVID has left this industry astray, and the government have to look for other ways to digitalize the backbone industry nation, the economy of the country, the hospitality, the tourism, and agriculture. And how this digitalization way has been slowly adopted by Asean countries, especially supported by Singapore, that shows having the technology ability can allow countries to recover faster, and as well, exploring digital tourism and support mobilization of people, allowing people having the skill to work online. So I think that's the silver lining, that the cooperation is good, and having people vaccinated is good, and having that opening slowly vaccinated travel lane is good, and as well being agile to move to look for opportunities is what I think in Southeast Asia, what multilateralism in this region would look like and need to explore. I think that's from me. I return to Fred. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Excellent. I have quite a few follow-up questions, but I will save those for later. So I will hand over to, moving to East Asia, I hand over to Dr. Tomo, please. I believe you have some PowerPoint slides to share. I think you can start.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. Can everybody see my slides? All right. So I'm not going to talk really about the region, East Asia, that you mentioned. I think when you ask me to talk about East Asia, probably you expect me to talk about CJK, China, Japan, and Korea. But today I'm not going to talk about these countries, nor I'm going to talk about how Japan has responded to the pandemic, because I think Japan's response to the pandemic wasn't really exemplary in any sense. It's more that a lot of problems that we have here in Japan was brought under light, whether it's a digital economy or how the government should respond in this kind of pandemic situation and so on. But I decided to talk about green finance, because I think that's something that matters, or going to matter most for international capital flows, which is a subject that I study in my research. And also, I think the issues of green finance is going to be very important when we think about multilateralism in the future to come. But I'm happy that if you have any other questions related to region's response to pandemic and so on, I'll be happy to answer them in the Q&A section. Right? Okay. First, when we look at the foreign direct investment flows into ASEAN, it is interesting that even though if you look at the number for 2019 and 2020, there is a dip. If you look at the share in the world, okay, it did not decline. So this kind of points to the fact that ASEAN remains to be a very popular destination for foreign direct investment. Where do these investment go to? You see, it's clearly Singapore takes the chunk of these investments and then followed by Indonesia and Vietnam and some other countries. Which are the countries that invest in Southeast Asia? In 2019 and 2020, actually the list, the top 10 investors are similar, but you see a big drop in Japan's investment in Southeast Asia. And I think that's really because of the pandemic. I don't have a very good explanation why Japan, and in this case also UK's investment has dropped so much relative to others. But the fact is that investment overall has dropped. Okay? And now the latest number for 2021 are coming out, even though they're still preliminary. And we can see that Japan's FDI is actually rebounding in 2021, especially in the second half, and this is led by growth in renewable energy and climate-related investment. Okay, the topic that I go into now. So green finance, what is this all about? It is said that we need to invest 80 trillion US dollars to keep the rise in the mean global temperature to well below 2% above pre-industrial level, which is the target in the Paris Agreement. And there are estimates that the so-called ESG assets, so environmental, social, governance assets, are on track to exceed 50 trillion US dollar by 2025, representing more than 1/3 of total global asset under management. And this means that all the industries are going to be affected by ESG assets or investment. In this, main actors will be the institutional investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, investment management firms, investment banks and central banks, etc. You might have heard of the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. This is a task force that's chaired by the former New York Mayor, Michael Bloomberg. What they're doing is trying to come up with new standards on how companies should disclose their climate-related financial risks. And many organizations across the board has started following their recommendations. Here I give some examples in Japan and Singapore. Bank of Japan, Monetary Authority of Singapore, DPIF, which is Japan's and world's largest pension fund, GIC, Temasek, they all follow TFCD's recommendations. Also, you might have heard somewhere that Tokyo Stock Exchange is going to be restructured from April this year. Currently, we still have these complicated market segments in the first section, second sections, and mothers and JustDAX and so on. They're all going to be rearranged into prime, standard, and growth segments. All the companies that are listed in the prime segment in the future are asked to disclose their climate-related financial risks following recommendation by TCFD. Similarly, last year, during the COP26, the IFRS Foundation announced the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board. What are they trying to achieve? Their mission is to deliver a comprehensive global baseline of sustainability-related disclosure standards that provide investors and other capital market participants with information about companies' sustainability-related risks and opportunities to help them make informed decisions. So my question here, this is a big question, is are we rewriting the rule of the game? And these international financial reporting standards are currently adopted in more than 140 jurisdictions around the world. What is really happening here is basically the market is trying to internalize the externality of environmental costs through decarbonization. And there are mainly three ways that I point out here. First, companies in the global north raise capital, invest in R&D and green technologies, and produce in global south. So here the green technology is a keyword. Second, and this is the point that I just mentioned, financial institutions in the global north decide on capital allocation by demanding disclosure of carbon footprints in supply chains and divesting stranded assets. And thirdly, I'm not going to go deep into this point in this talk, but consumers in the global north shift cost to producers in the global south by imposing carbon. Right, why does this matter so much when it comes to global capital flows? To understand that, we have to understand the characteristics, the main characteristics of global capital flows, and I point out three of them here. First is that governments, including pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so on, accumulate foreign reserves in the global north. Okay? And when I say global north, this is basically United States and Europe, USD and Euro. Second, multinational companies raise capital, okay, equity or bonds in the global north. And that means the institutional investor in the rest of the world invest in them. And we call this phenomenon upstream portfolio investment. Upstream because these capital flows are from the global south to the global north. Third, multinationals invest in production globally, and we call this downstream FDI because these are multinational activities, companies from the global north investing in the global south. We know that FDI contributes to economic growth, but not always. Okay? And it does so through technology transfer, especially in countries, in host countries with developed financial markets and high human capital. If these conditions are not met, FDI often does not even contribute to economic growth. What's happening overall, when you look at global capital flows, is that capital flows out of Asia in terms of portfolio investment and foreign reserves to finance physical and intangible capital accumulation in the US and Europe, and is reinvested back in Asia for production. I think now you start getting the sense of why green finance will matter so much for the region of our interests. The biggest challenge in Asia is obviously, if you look at this chart, it's pretty much the only region where the energy consumption is expected to grow from now until 2050. Okay, so this is the red part in these bars, and you can see that it's the only part that really is expanding rapidly. So green finance and investment will reinforce the asymmetries in global capital flows and disproportionately increase cost of production in Asia because of these 3 points. The first, trade-off between economic development and decarbonization is greater in Asia than anywhere else in the world, as 50% increase in the world energy usage by 2050 will be led by growth in Asia. Secondly, as I just pointed out, technologies are with companies in the global north, and technology transfer is limited because of underdeveloped human capital and capital markets in the region. After all, the multinational companies in the global north are the ones to decide which technologies to adapt. And lastly, capital, not just technology, but also capital is the institutional investors in the global north, and they're going to decide which sector to allocate capital. How about Japan? And my primary question here is, can we better utilize Japan's capital? As you probably know, there is not much scope for domestic investment growth in Japan, mainly because of the expectation that Japan's economy will no longer expand. On the other hand, Japan has a lot of excess cash and capital. It's crazy that 54% of household assets are held in cash. This ratio is higher than any other OECD countries. And as you probably know, Japan has been accumulating net foreign assets, and it's still rising, and it's already the largest in the world. Secondly, lastly, Japan still has technologies in the many sectors that's going to be relevant for the future to come. Green technology, urban infrastructure, and transportation, and so on. When we look at portfolio investment stock of Japan, a capital flow that I said is going to be relevant for institutional investors, here I picked the CJK, so China and Hong Kong combined, and Japan and Korea. What you see is a trend that China and Hong Kong combined invest a lot more in East Asia and Pacific than Japan does. Okay, Hong Kong and China combined allocate more than half of their portfolio to East Asia and Pacific, whereas the number for Japan is only 22%. What I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of scope for Japanese portfolio investment to be directed to the region and also ASEAN and Southeast Asia. Right, and why is this relevant? Because first of all, because that presents us with opportunities in growing economies that need capital and technology. And I would argue that portfolio investment must be more in sync with FDI and trade to build a more autonomous ecosystem from saving to investments. And we need to decide which technology to adopt and which sectors to allocate capital. Okay. And if that done properly, governments in the regions can invest more in infrastructure by crowding in private sectors, and also companies can invest more in R&D, which would lead to technological innovation and stronger regional infrastructure. And there are a lot of opportunities out there in ASEAN. Tokyo and Singapore, I'm just listing here 6 points. There are a lot more than this, but Tokyo and Singapore as regional green infrastructure finance hub. We can talk about strengthening the function of Asia bond market initiatives. Greater role could be played by AMRO, the organization that manages the TEMA initiative multilateral, based in Singapore. A lot more can be done in terms of transition finance to help countries in the region transition to more sustainable production and energy sources. Here, one critical issue is going to be how to deal with stranded assets, with coal power plant, and so on. Regional supply chains, I think this was also mentioned by the previous speaker. ASEAN Economic Community, RCEP, CPTPP, these are all important elements for strengthening regional supply chains, regional infrastructure, master plan on ASEAN connectivity, smart cities. This is also an area where Japan now puts a lot of effort and energy to, because in Japan, we have the aging society, and there may be know-how and skill that can be transferred also to the region, especially for countries that are going to soon also experience aging society, urbanization, public service, and transportation. I mentioned here the ASEAN smart city networks, and lastly, digital transformation. So let me conclude, because I think my time is up. 3 points. Climate change presents risks and disruptions globally, and therefore decarbonization must be a goal for all countries. But economic development is a right for all countries too, and we should not forget that 80% of CO2 emissions in history are by today's developed countries. Okay. Second, green finance and investment must find solution to the trade-off between economic development and decarbonization in the region, which I believe is generally different. The trade-off is different in the region from that in the global north. And lastly, social cost of carbon models estimate that 80% of the cost of climate change will be on developing countries. So better utilization of capital, technology, know-how in Japan for the region is in the interest of both Japan, and ASEAN. Thank you very much. I will stop here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tomo. I have interesting presentation. I have quite a few follow-up questions, but once again, I will save those for a later stage. So let's move from the east of Asia to the southwest of Asia and go to Cinder. Cinder, please, are you ready for South Asia?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Are you ever ready for South Asia? But thanks, CMS. Thank you, Fred, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So before I start, I just want to make two qualifications so that later down when you listen to my presentation and get quite bored, I really have made my excuses. The first is I'm definitely not an economist by any stretch of definition. So coming after Tomo, one has to make that qualification. I'm also not a political economist. I'm an international relations guy who studies the international relations of South Asia. I look at the link between domestic politics and foreign policy, specifically in India, in the case of India, that's one. Number two, I think Fred, on some levels, sort of set me up to fail because he gave me the South Asia is never known for any example of regional cooperation since 1945, right? 47 when you count India's independence, but never mind. Sometimes the bad examples also help. So with those qualifiers, I basically, I'll try to take 10 minutes. I got about four main points to make. I think first point is, we all appreciate the fact that, South Asia is larger than India. India isn't South Asia. South Asia is more than India. But I think to try to understand regionalism or regional multilateralism within South Asia, one must really understand how the Indian state thinks, how the Indian state behaves, because what India does has a, unlike even comparing to Southeast Asia, for example, or any other region in Asia, India's influence in South Asia is disproportionate compared to any other country put together, right? So let me just make one observation about the Indian state more recently. I think one trend has been, okay, let's just quickly step back a bit. The interesting thing about India from 2014 onwards was when the BJP government came to power. The BJP traditionally, ideologically, has been a party that's actually more pro-market, more pro-liberal or trade liberalization, economic liberalization compared to the earlier Congress parties that over time have been the ruling government in India. And you could see that in 2014 when they came to power, there was a lot of rhetoric about carrying on the kind of economic liberalization that India started to undertake from about 1992 onwards. But I see a swing in 2019. I see a change in 2019. And I think that 2019 change basically reflected, given I follow this relatively closely, a deep sense, or increasing sense of skepticism about trade liberalization within India. That somehow trade liberalization hasn't, or economic liberalization at the multilateral level hasn't helped India. And you could see this. Of course, it wasn't a very easy debate because I think there were parts of the Indian state that didn't agree with this sentiment, but there are other parts within the Indian state and domestic politics, different constituencies who thought trade liberalization wasn't a good thing. And you see this played out, by the way, in the way in which India finally decided not to sign RCEP, right? So you get this narrative of, oh, they're going to sign, and then in the end they don't sign. And I sort of be giving the many trips some of me and my colleagues make to Delhi, you could see the kind of tension within New Delhi about RCEP. And I think the one statement that summed up the Indian view about RCEP was, you are asking us to sign a trade agreement for strategic reasons. And that summed up the Indian view, that we're going to lose out economically. The only reason to sign RCEP was for strategic reasons, not to be left out of the kind of this big kind of multilateral kind of formation in what you call the Indo-Pacific, if you must. And I think part of the driving force behind this has largely been India's changing perceptions of the relationship with China. So I think if you want to talk big picture, I think from 2014, the BJP government's view was that we will be very strong with China in terms of what, in the security realm, we will show where our red lines are, but we also engage China economically. You know, the kind of Southeast Asian argument that, you know, if you engage China economically, after a while it will change, it will become better. We all know those arguments. So in a sense, the Indian state in 2014 sort of embarked on that. I think in 2019, about 2018, 2019, came to power in the second term, there was actually a sea change. I think the sea change was basically that India's economic engagement with China was personally not helping India, it was actually helping China. And increasing trade relations with China was actually a strategic liability for the Indian state, right? And in a sense, that feeds into the RCEP kind of decision because China is there. And I think more and more, the boogeyman of the trade deficit kept being raised as a huge strategic liability that somehow China's behavior is not going to change. And this is in the context of the kind of border clashes that India and China had for the last 2 years. So here then you go into the kind of American style decoupling mood, right? You get the mood in New Delhi that we need to decouple everything, right? We cannot carry on the old ASEAN East Asian model where you engage economically, but we look for security from the US, but we look for economics from China, the kind of model. The Indian state, I think by 2019 decided that that was it. And then it's also reflected in the sense there were various kind of slogans or campaigns within India. One was the Make in India campaign. And then the other one, the Atmanirbhar, which basically loosely translates as, you know, self-sufficiency in India. And this, in a sense, hark back to the kind of earlier self-sufficiency debates India had post-independence, 1950s, 1960s. Of course, there are differences, but again, this sort of reflects the mood within India about what trade or economic multilateralism can do for it, especially if China is involved. So that's kind of big framing of the Indian state and how it views regional economic multilateralism. Now, the next point about just looking specifically at South Asia. Now, South Asia, the main regional body in South Asia, the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, SAARC, is, you know, to put it nicely, is basically an institution that actually doesn't really matter. It hasn't done much. It can't even hold annual summits most of the time because India-Pakistan relations basically dominate the nature of the SAARC relationship. So SAARC has been actually largely been dead for a long time. In fact, I think from 2014 onwards, I think the Indian state decided that more and more the kind of SAARC process was completely, there's no point investing any time and resources into that. I think there's a slight change in 2020 when March 2020, when I think the pandemic started to hit. And surprisingly, India then suggested a South Asian-wide initiative for a fund for the countries to fight the pandemic. So India said they will contribute, and they did about pledged about $10 million as a, you know, and the other countries contributed as well, Bangladesh and the rest. Some, of course, some tensions between India and Pakistan about who should hold the money, normal stuff. But basically, there was a fund. And through that fund, I think that, you know, India provided medical supplies, testing kits, etc. And also, I think India in that time, around that period, was in an advantageous position because of its role as one of the leading producers of medical supplies and, you know, generic medicine, but medical supplies. So India then was able to send out masks, other kind of testing kits, etc. And also, of course, don't forget, through the Serum Institute of India, India is one of the co-producers of the AstraZeneca vaccine. So then India very quickly then started, you know, pushing out the vaccine to countries in South Asia, right? And some were given as just grants, free. Some countries started purchasing from India as well. So this was like at that point, a lot of analysts said, wow, maybe the SAARC process can be revived. Regional multilateralism actually might have been helped by the pandemic, you know, that maybe, you know, if you use the functionalism literature, you do small things and then, you know, you go up. And maybe, you know, COVID was the catalyst that maybe SAARC needed. I think the problem then, of course, occurs, something beyond India's control. A new variant hits India, and then India itself finds there are not enough medical supplies. You know, the whole specter of people going from hospital to hospital to find oxygen cylinders, vaccines also from a net surplus, having a net surplus of vaccines to give out. India then found itself in a position of not being able to have enough to quickly vaccinate its population. So India then stopped sending medical supplies and vaccines out, and that's on some level left a bit of a sour taste in some of the regional countries' mouth, because some of them actually had paid for some of the vaccines which India then couldn't deliver. Now, India is not the only player when it comes to the kind of pandemic regional multilateralism kind of project. China was there as well. China initiated a South Asia-wide initiative, directly gave grants and loans through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, also gave out loans to Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Maldives, example. And then, of course, like India, China also is a producer of the vaccine. And then China started giving vaccines to countries in South Asia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. And so then, of course, there was a problem because the Chinese said that India is welcome to join the initiative. And of course, the Indians said that, no, I think this is South Asia is India's, use the words properly, I won't say sphere of influence, but backyard. And other countries shouldn't come in here. But that's kind of historical Indian position. So you see immediately that the kind of regional kind of efforts to deal with the vaccine then becomes a place of contestation between India and China immediately, right? And then now my third point is about another regional organization which is not totally encompassing South Asia, which is called BIMSTEC. I'm not going to tell you what the acronym stands for because most of the time I miss out one of them. But it's largely supposed it's a relatively old organization which was started with the aim of trying to help the Bay of Bengal countries to facilitate economic interaction, etc. You have two Southeast Asian countries within BIMSTEC. You got because the Bay of Bengal littoral, so you got Myanmar and Thailand. You also have two landlocked countries, Bhutan and Nepal, who are also members of BIMSTEC. And BIMSTEC is quite an interesting case study because I think once from 2014 onwards, the Indian state decided largely that SARC process was a waste of time. They started investing a lot of resources and time into BIMSTEC. So BIMSTEC then became the flavor of the month, if you must. And the Indian state actually went one step further and kept saying, maybe we should introduce kind of security areas of cooperation within BIMSTEC, which was very, quite new because in a sense, the Indian state traditionally always was very wary about security cooperation within the region because, it was the kind of security manager. That sort of, it stopped and all. And there was some discussion that BIMSTEC actually could be a place where regional efforts were made to deal with the pandemic's fallout. Unfortunately, nothing much happened. There'll be a lot of discussion, I think, within India, certain regional think tanks, even at, I think, the BIMSTEC Secretariat, about maybe coordination in terms of public health, maybe having protocols to cross borders. But at the moment, nothing really has happened at the BIMSTEC level, given the amount of time the Indian state has tried to devote to this regional organization. In a sense, it's a bit disappointing, I think, especially for people in India and some of the other BIMSTEC members. Now, I just conclude with my last point because I think Fred said maybe we should try to tease out some larger kind of ideas and maybe lessons, etc. I think for me, the interesting kind of thing, interesting aspect about how India has dealt with the pandemic and in terms of trying to forge regional cooperation is that I think in Southeast Asia, for a large part, the security cooperation, the security area was seen as zero sum, right? So you got two poles, we say India, US and China. So you usually chose one for security, chose one for economics, and then that was the kind of Southeast Asian balance. And I think for a long time, the Indian state sort of, at least from 2014 onwards, thought that would be a good way to engage China, the socialization, the kind of neoliberal logic that everyone has a stake, and then so countries behave themselves because the kind of economic benefits. But I think this kind of South Asian example shows that the economic regionalism or economic multilateralism is no longer as well insulated from the kind of security relationships that happen. And whether that's going to happen in Southeast Asia or not, I don't know. Right? But in the South Asian case, it's very clear. Right? And to the extent that India would not get involved in kind of a vaccine or pandemic kind of initiative that China starts in South Asia, because I think in Indian perceptions, nothing is economic anymore. Everything is strategic, right? So I think in a sense, I don't know whether that works for Southeast Asia. Maybe that's why Southeast Asia sometimes has some reservations about the term Indo-Pacific, because I think the idea of the Indo-Pacific basically being more about geopolitics, more about security rather than economic multilateralism. So maybe I'll stop there, Fred. Thank you again for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. We are very delighted to have you. Thank you so much for your time here. No, I think it's great that you finished on that note of the security kind of penetrating multilateralism, right, or strategic consideration. I think this has always been a particular problem of multilateralism, right, that it is always impossible to kind of insulate multilateral arrangement from strategic and security question as much as actors try. But perhaps this is something we can later also in the broader discussion go into for all the regions. It's a very interesting point as tensions perhaps heat up for pandemic, but also for various other reasons. But before we do that, let's go furthest afield and let's look at Australia and the Pacific. And I mentioned once again, Singapore has become the latest dialogue partner of the Pacific Islands Forum, proud to say. So perhaps on that note, I hand over to Dr. Tess.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you to your centre and RSIS for inviting me to be part of this panel. I pass on best regards from Professor Byrne, who was originally scheduled, but she's kindly offered me this opportunity to talk with you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the unceded land from which I join you this evening in Brisbane, or Meanjin, as it's known in the traditional languages of its owners. So multilateralism and regional activity in the Pacific is always, well, for some of us, it's always a source of endless fascination. Sometimes it's a source of concern. And certainly that's been no different during the duration of the pandemic to date. And we can certainly point to a number of instances and milestones and critical junctures, if you like, where the global pandemic has intersected with pre-existing regional mechanisms and tensions. And we've, the way that the Pacific regional architecture has responded to that has been quite instructive. Now, my brief is Australia and the Pacific. So Australia within the Pacific regional environment occupies a couple of places. On the one hand, Australia is a full member of the Pacific Islands Forum. The forum has 18 members, and Australia is also a member of other Pacific organizations, regional organizations, but also Australia, as I'm sure you're aware, is a principal security and development partner for the region and has very significant bilateral relations with a number of Pacific Island countries. So throughout the duration of the pandemic, we've seen Australia operating in various ways, sometimes as a member of a multilateral organization, the Pacific Islands Forum, and sometimes as a bilateral partner with Pacific Island countries. So I'm predominantly going to focus on what's been happening within the regional architecture. I am happy to talk further during Q&A about Australia's work as a bilateral partner, but I'd really like to sort of provide some insight into what's been happening in the regional space. So for those of you who aren't aware, the Pacific Islands Forum is a political grouping. So it's the apex political grouping for the Pacific Islands region. It's not subject to treaty, so it's not a treaty organization. it's a, it's a club, if you like, which membership is voluntary. There's no political bargain. There's no Pacific Parliament. Everybody sort of participates in regional activities to the extent that they see it as being beneficial to them, subject to their own national interests. It obviously, the region is very diverse, both socially, culturally, and economically. So on the one hand, you've got Papua New Guinea, which is a country of, we're not quite sure, but it's probably around 11 million people. And then you've got Niue, which is 1,600 people. Some countries are very dependent on tourism. Others have significant mineral resources that they draw on. Some countries are very dependent on remittances. So it's a very diverse region. And so I guess that's the first thing that I would want to point to, is that whilst the pandemic affected everybody, it affected countries in the Pacific differently depending on what their pre-existing situations were. So for example, Fiji and Cook Islands have huge dependency on tourism for their economies, and obviously they took huge hits. Other countries such as Solomon Islands, for example, and Kiribati, don't have particularly well-developed tourism industries, but were affected in other ways. So for example, Kiribati really struggled with things like being able to repatriate seafarers who had, completed contracts and were basically left stranded because the borders had been closed and they couldn't get home, and they couldn't even really get close to home. So we saw that, and obviously that diversity of impact feeds into how regional responses can be developed and implemented, and the extent to which national governments and national agencies see regional responses as being beneficial to them. So under the auspices of the forum, two things happened fairly quickly, and they happened subsequent to national borders being closed. And as you may have seen from some of the media coverage, Pacific Island countries were among the first to close their borders, and they closed them tight, and some of them have yet to reopen. And that means that for some countries, they remain COVID-free. They've had no COVID cases. Other countries such as Vanuatu, that I'm a citizen of, have had a very small number of cases, and they've been able to keep them at the border with very little community transmission. That has changed recently, but up until the end of last year, up until the Omicron variant, we had a number of countries in the Pacific that had no exposure to COVID whatsoever. And that was as a result of closing the borders and keeping them very tightly closed, making entry into their countries extremely difficult, including for their own people. So at the regional level, the forum did two things. The first was to invoke the Bikitawa Declaration, which is a long-standing declaration. It dates back to 2000, which is the preeminent regional mechanism for responding to member states' needs for assistance in times of crisis. It's been used on a small number of occasions previously. Most visibly was as a means of activating Ramsey, Operation Help and Friend, during the tensions, or to help restore stability and law and order into Solomon Islands after the tensions that ended in 2003. So under the terms of the Bikitawa Declaration, the forum leaders then instigated what's called the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway for COVID-19. And this is a world first. It's, it's a unique multilateral regional response to the pandemic in the region. And I think this is the second lesson that I think is really important and I think it's been touched on by other speakers, is that whilst, yes, this was a health crisis, and that brings with it lots of technical issues around PPE and vaccines, essentially what a lot of this comes down to is political activism and political will, and how that can operate both nationally and then across borders. At the time that the PHPC was introduced, the chair of the forum was Tuvalu, and Tuvalu has a particular vested interest in the PHPC, in that there are no direct flights to Tuvalu. In order to fly to Tuvalu, you have to go to Fiji first. So having borders closed, it made it really, really difficult for countries like Tuvalu to access critical supplies, including health supplies as needed. So the PHPC has been generally well regarded. It's been able to move, its intention was to be able to enable efficient movement of medical supplies, humanitarian assistance and technical assistance to PIF states. And it has had some success in doing that. So by April 2021, the Pacific Air Service, which is the logistical arm of the PHPC, had delivered more than 221,000 kilograms of health supplies and humanitarian cargo, and been able to move 111 technical personnel across the region. And so that's considering that the borders were closed and there were lots of concern about moving people from countries that did have COVID into countries that didn't. That is obviously a significant achievement on the part of the region to be able to have in place this pathway. Now, in terms of how well that's been used by other partners, I think then it gets a little more, a little grayer. And I think picking up on what we heard from Dr. Singh, this pandemic has played out at a time of increased geostrategic anxiety and competition. The Pacific has been, the focus of a lot of all sorts of things. And one of the impacts of that is that for strategic reasons and competition reasons, we've seen a reversion or a preference on the part of a number of partners to use bilateral pathways for providing support to Pacific Island countries, rather than necessarily going through the regional pathway that was established. And we've seen this on the part of Australia. So yes, they have been part of PHPC, but they've also used their bilateral relations. And we've seen a lot of vaccine diplomacy, for example. It's often used in reference to what China does, but there's no reason to think that that term can't be used in relation to other people as well. So whether it's provision of PPE, technical assistance, medical teams, vaccines, a lot of that into the Pacific has been done on a bilateral basis. Obviously, whilst the Pacific up until quite recently has been able to avoid the worst of the health impacts or the direct health impacts of COVID-19, it hasn't been so lucky when it comes to economic impacts. And the economic impacts in the Pacific have been really quite significant. Again, because of the diversity of the region, I think the ADB assessed that in 2020, the contraction across the region as a whole was 4.3%. But in some places, it was a lot worse than that. So in Fiji, it was getting closer to 20% at the end of that year, because Fiji was so dependent on the tourism. And Fiji basically used tourism as its way out. And that's what it was always aiming towards. Under the Forum Economic Ministers meeting, which is a standing meeting of the Forum, one of two that they have, they established an economic recovery task force, which is still in play. And again, that was a commitment to work together as a region in order to leverage regional mechanisms with appropriate resourcing provided to ensure that outcomes have a long-term and sustainable impact in building and strengthening the economic resilience of the region. Now, again, the extent to which that's been able to be put into practice and deliver what Fred would call the concrete deliverables has been a bit mixed. One of the issues that the Recovery Task Force was very keen to address was the issue of debt in the region, ranging from where debt needs to be used through debt swaps, and also assisting countries that may be subject to debt distress. The Forum Secretariat had hoped to convene a debt conference either late last year or early this year. It's not clear whether that will go ahead. There's been a whole range of other issues going on in the background that mean the Forum has been quite distracted by its own internal machinations. one of the things that I think we have seen at a national level and is feeding into the regional conversation is that COVID-19 has demonstrated again what a number of countries have already known, which is that they need to think about diversifying their economies. So reliance on one thing, and they've seen this before with natural disasters, but obviously, as it turns out, your tourism industry recovers a lot quicker from a cyclone than it does from a global pandemic that spans more than 2 years. So, you know, we've seen at national level. So, for example, Vanuatu has pivoted quite strongly to not abandoning tourism, but really focusing on a reinvestment and a reprioritization of agriculture, not including for food security issues, import substitution, and then increasingly for export. So I think we'll see more conversations like that. I think in some ways that is possibly a silver lining. And I'll just finish with, I am going to finish because I'm sure there are questions, but one of the things that the leadership of the Pacific has been at pains to stress, and I think is a really important issue, is that they have been dealing with this at the same time as dealing with all the stuff they already had to deal with. And as far as they're concerned, climate change is still their primary security concern. A number of countries, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, have had to deal with handling or responding to natural disasters as well, and trying to keep their communities COVID safe. So we've had a lot of work done around contactless aid. It has had the double-edged sword, or the mixed result of having to rely a lot more on local systems for responding and managing these disasters, and that has had good and less good impacts. So climate change didn't go away. The pre-existing developmental challenges that the Pacific Islands countries were dealing with, they didn't take 2 years off. They've still been present. We've seen an incredible highlight shone on the pre-existing weaknesses and frailties of domestic health systems. And that's the main reason that we've been so desperate to keep COVID out of these countries, is because the resources, both the human capital, the physical resources, and just the energy just isn't there to be able to take on something like this. And, we're seeing that play out in Solomon Islands at the moment with really tragic impacts. So all of these things have been ongoing. People are exhausted, as we all are. There've been some we talk a lot about Pacific resilience, and it's been very much on display in the last 2 and a bit years, but it's important that we don't let resilience become some sort of smoke screen for, oh, well, they'll just keep going. There are some really significant weaknesses and points of tension and friction that will need to be addressed, and there will be longer term impacts that we will be dealing with in the Pacific for a long time. On that note, Fred, I'm going to close there, and hopefully we can pick up other things in conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tess. That was great, giving us some insights here into a region into a sub-region where at least myself have probably the least knowledge of all of the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. So I thank you very much for this. I must say, as a student of multilateralism for somewhat close to 2 decades now, I'm particularly annoyed with the re-emergence of bilateralism. Right, we see this everywhere, and in all the presentation, it kind of came through. Right, it starts with vaccine diplomacy, for example, right, which is something that particularly annoys me. If we were all really so concerned about distributing vaccines equally around the world, we would all donate to the COVAX facility, and we would make sure that there would be some sort of multilateral arrangement. But now, of course, countries that donate there is no such thing as a free lunch, right? They want something out of it. And there's so much to unpack here, and so little time left. So what I will do is I will only focus on a few questions that came in the Q&A functions. But I I want to start with Dr. Tess. Perhaps I go in reverse order, and I think most of the questions that have been come through in the chat box actually can somehow be asked to all of us, to all of our panelists. But specifically to Dr. Tess, I was wondering that you spoke about this Pacific. Bear with me, I can't quite remember the name. It was like Pacific Humanitarian Assistance Pact or something like something along those lines, right? And you said it has a mixed result, but I wonder specifically if the Pacific Islands perhaps can find a way to build on this, right? So you mentioned, for example, that we need to address the healthcare systems, for example, the inability of the healthcare systems in the Pacific Islands to manage. And perhaps I wonder if this is something that we can take as a silver lining, that on this agreement, perhaps we can use this as a mechanism for the Pacific Islands to develop further, to cooperate a lot more long-term, right, beyond this pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And certainly there is a hope that the political success of the PHPC will allow for further mechanisms to be developed, including the Pacific Resilience Facility, which has been in development for some time. And again, the Secretariat was hoping to convene a pledging conference around that facility. So I think there is definitely scope for that, and I think we see it in other areas. So we see it in Haydars, and we saw it in relation to the riots in Solomon Islands. That not just, whilst yes, there might be Australia and New Zealand and other big countries coming in, but countries within the region can also offer support. It may not be as big a support. It might only be 50 people from Papua New Guinea or 30 people from Fiji. But obviously when they go into other Pacific Island countries, and we saw this in Ramsey, they bring with them huge linguistic and cultural resources that maybe other countries can't offer. And so they can actually be really, really valuable contributors of specific, knowing how to be in a Pacific context, be comfortable around with, go to their own people, essentially, work among their own people. And those contributions are really well regarded in other areas. And there's certainly scope for this now. I think what it has demonstrated that in order to be able to have that sort of pooled resource is each country is going to have to develop its own internal resources. So, there just hasn't been any scope for anyone to say, well, we've got 20 nurses we can spare, we can send them to you for a month, because there just is so little extra capacity over it. I mean, there isn't sufficient capacity to meet national needs, let alone to have an excess for regional needs, especially when you've got something like this that affects everybody all at once. But I think the concept, it has definitely gained some traction, and I think it is something that will be revisited. But your point about bilateralism is very clear, and particularly even with the COVAX, that small countries or poor countries in the Pacific are dependent on mechanisms like COVAX, and because COVAX hasn't been as well supported as it should have been, it means that we're now looking at Papua New Guinea might not be fully vaccinated till the end of 2026 or something. It's just, it's quite, it is disappointing, I think. Thank you.
Yes, to me too. I second that. So there is a question here in the question box specifically addressing Fiji, but I think this is something that others perhaps can also chime in if they want to. So Indonesia has been, it's by my colleague Joel, and Indonesia has been pushing for the ASEAN travel corridor. And the question really is, how realistic is this? And this really syncs with that we have in all the presentations, somehow the tourism as being the worst affected sector, right? So the question here really is, how realistic is the ASEAN travel corridor? And related to this, Ms. Rose Cornista, who is a self-identified Filipino diplomat based in Brunei, and she's wondering whether opening up for tourism is actually the right step at this space, as cases are still going up. So is this realistic, and is it also justifiable to kind of open up? I think as far as the regions of the world go, we will discuss more later next week. But as far as the region of the world go, East Asia is probably slowest in terms of opening up. Perhaps Fitri, you want to start?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Joe. Yes, ASEAN already have travel corridor arrangement framework pushed since 2020. And I think we've seen a lot of people starting to travel from Indonesia, already traveled to the US, to Europe. And why is it so? And why is it so? Because European Union, for example, already allow travelers to go around their area as long as they complete this prerequisite of health protocols, which is fully vaccination or now having booster, recovery for COVID for them, having a negative PCR test. I think Australia has decided to open its border in 21st February as well. And I think the reason that we have this kind of fear is that we kind of see this Southeast Asia country as this poor country, and then you should not give away to the people that cannot afford vaccines, so on and so forth. But in reality, I know a lot of people, Indonesian, Singaporean, that have been traveling to Europe, to the US, to just because people are bored and they afford to have tested, they already got vaccine, they're safe. And I think this is one way to boost the economy of the region. And I think because of the meeting between Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and Jokowi, there's an agreed vaccinated travel lanes to Batam and Bintan between Indonesia starting end of this month, I think. And that kind of need to be that kind of hesitancy need to be questioned. Why is going to other countries are being seen as scary? Why is this country being as a backwater or not having fully vaccinated, while not having the effort to push for the vaccination and then push for the opening up? I think having that, having the travel corridor would actually bring the realization that we need to have equitable vaccine as well. That's my argument. Okay. Maybe the other have other opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. There is something I've been wondering about when Tomo had his presentation about green finance, right? I thought, especially in this conversation about tourism, right? We heard Dr. Tess talking about how important tourism is for certain countries in the Pacific Islands, right? Fiji, for example, too dependent, and we need to see some sort of diversification of the economy. And in Southeast Asia, we have a similar problem, right? Some countries more, some countries less, but a lot of Southeast Asian countries are dependent on tourism, especially countries like Thailand, the Philippines, and others as well, right? Even Singapore to some extent. So the question here really is, it will probably, if ever, it will take probably a decade to come back to this kind of intense tourism that we had previously. And one may even argue that we do not even want to go back to these mass tourism days, right? So the question here really for Tomo is, I wonder in your presentation, I wondered if this green finance and this decarbonization industry is something that we can somehow capitalize on to kind of fill this void, right? So if decarbonization and climate change problems are the future challenges we need to deal with, is there a possibility to somehow diversify our economy? Is there any value added for in terms of economic growth here beyond tourism if we focus on these kind of sectors? Does that make sense, Tomo?
I don't really understand the question, but obviously tourism, if it requires a long-hour flight, that's not really desirable from the viewpoint of decarbonization, because these large aircraft carriers, they consume a lot of fossil fuels, right? But of course, at the same time, we have a trend about ecotourism, and I mean, and of course, there are a lot of alternative values that are, I think, coming up, whether it's onshoring of production or more circular economy. And I think digital economy is going to play a big role. So many things will be done in new way. Only thing I think we cannot dismiss is flying, because we might have EV cars everywhere soon, but we're not going to have EV flights anytime soon in the future. Yeah.
Thank you. Cinda, I also have a question for you, which you gave us quite a negative perspective on SAARC, right? On the state of the traditional way multilateralism is being practiced in South Asia. And I kind of echo this. I've been to the SAARC secretariat a few times, and I was always a bit underwhelmed by. I mean, I was struck by how positive everybody is, but underwhelmed by the actual results, right? So, and then you mentioned BIMSTEC at the end, and BIMSTEC is something I haven't really studied in great detail, but I wonder if this is perhaps the future of multilateralism and for South Asia, and if this is so, why? I mean, what's the main difference? Perhaps Pakistan not being a member, and then this kind of problem somehow being sidelined. But is this the future? And is there some cooperation within BIMSTEC on the pandemic recovery?
Thanks, Fred. First question. I think the SAARC's biggest problem, of course, is that I think that the kind of India-Pakistan kind of relationship, it is so fragile that, as I said, they have had problems trying to hold annual summits. I mean, that's a really low bar. People getting together, and they can't do that though, right? So that's, I mean, when you talk about how bad ASEAN is, you look the other way. So maybe there's, you pat yourself on the back. The BIMSTEC thing is interesting because I think it was there for a while, and then it sort of went dormant. And I think the new Indian government's view was that this is a body that we want to try to invest in. Also, I think it's part of kind of India's what you call Act East policy as well, because here you have a nice little maritime region which shows how connected India is to Southeast Asia, because you got Thailand and then you got Myanmar as well. And I think in the backdrop of also India trying to claim, or at least India continually putting itself forward to say that it should become a participant in the Malacca Straits patrols, for example, which is, India's claim is that if you count the Andaman Islands, which is the mouth of the Straits of Malacca, then India should be considered at least half a littoral state of the Straits of Malacca, because if, and I think we have those issues. I mean, Singapore, Indonesia, and Malaysia disagree about whether India should be allowed to be part of that. So I think that's part of a larger kind of Indian outreach, and also India trying to say, again, I think it comes down to some extent about the kind of India-China competition, which is if the Chinese want to make initiatives in our region, we can go to Southeast Asia and also do things which then will trouble the Chinese. And to be fair to India, reverse, right, mirror image, India actually has no historical baggage in Southeast Asia. It's actually on a very good wicket, right? Because unlike maybe Japan, China, India is actually in a very good footing because there is no issues. I guess same with China in South Asia, right? China doesn't carry any baggage with the South Asian countries, while India has a historical baggage of being the hegemon, the big brother, etc. So I think that's where BIMSTEC is going. In terms of BIMSTEC doing pandemic work, not really at the moment, from what I know, not really. I think there'll be a lot of proposals to do more things. I think it goes back to the point that Tess made earlier. The problem here is that there's not enough domestic capacity to get things done at home. And if you look around at the BIMSTEC countries, everyone will look towards India to do something, right? Because that's the largest state. India calls itself a leading global rising power. To be fair, before this, India actually tried to play the role of first responder, or we call net security provider, within a kind of Indian Ocean region, which was in terms of, if there was a natural disaster, India will be the first one there. So basically, if you want to go call somebody, call me first, right? I'm the guy who will take care of you in a non-security kind of issues, right? Cyclones, etc. But of course, again, that became problematic when the MH370 flight thing happened, when the Chinese then tested India's interpretation of UNCLOS and freedom of navigation, when the Chinese sent a search and rescue vessel right through the Bay of Bengal, where the Indians said, no, you can't send it here. This is our, this is our EEZ, we won't allow it. So again, I think in terms of BIMSTEC, it's a part of kind of Indian wider Southeast Asian link as well, trying to do something there. And I think, to be fair, just the last point, I think the more recent kind of interesting developments with India, ASEAN, in the terms of kind of BIMSTEC and others, there was huge disappointment with RCEP, but actually India-Indonesia relations the last 2-3 years have really shot up in the kind of maritime realm. And I think now they're trying to look for areas in the non-security realm to cooperate. So maybe one of them could be kind of pandemic related work. I mean, India floated the Quad Plus initiative. I don't know whether you heard, right? The Quad Plus was, the other countries refused to call it Quad Plus, but there were Quad countries, and then they added, I think, some strange, like I think it was South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam or something. And it was all talking about, pandemic coordination and so on. So maybe that's the way for the future. You got things that are already there, like the Quad, and you add a couple of countries. Of course, the big prize would be to get Indonesia, right? So I don't know if that will happen or not, but thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. We are already at the end. We only have 5 minutes left. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to give me 1 minute, 1 minute each, speaking for your respective regions as well as you possibly can, on a question that has been raised by Mohammed Gibran. He doesn't let us in where he's from, but he's basically pointing to the fact that in many European countries, it's no longer mandatory to wear masks, and Sweden has lifted all COVID measures. The country where I originate from a long lifetime ago, Germany, they're also having their Freedom Day very soon, where they will lift all COVID measures, I guess, making good on the promise of living with COVID, right? So the question here really is, what is the new phase in your respective regions? Can you see any commonalities? Where do you think is it going? Will we at some point live with COVID, but instead of just saying that we will live with COVID, actually doing what we preach, right? So actually saying, okay, we live with COVID, which means accepting that we have to have high case numbers, and we just go on anyway, right? So perhaps 1 minute at the most for each of you, what you think is going to be the new phase, the new normal in your respective regions. If I can ask you to speak in the order you presented in, if that's okay. So starting with Fitri, please.
Okay, 1 minute. What is the new normal? I think there would be, mask wearing at least. If not, it's just health protocol. Digitalization is increasing. The exchange of information between countries. Having digital vaccination certificate that is accepted by countries. That was being said before, the regional travel corridor. It's a good idea. And how to support operation for businesses to start again. I think that's important, and that's what the countries in Southeast Asia would like to see progressed. That's 1 minute for me.
Thank you. Tomo, your turn.
Okay, you probably know Japan started or had a very strict border measures. It just announced, the government announced that it's going to relax it from March, but still the number of people is capped at 5,000 a day, and it's going to be mainly just student and business people. I think for tourism, we have to wait until summer. I think at least until the lower house election in Japan is over. I'm really annoyed by current administration that are so sensitive to the election, and basically the island mentality of Japanese people, that they somehow think that the impact of the pandemic comes from outside the country, while I think the number of cases are spreading within the country. I think there's going to be a big difference whether you're dealing with the Delta variant or Omicron variant. In Japan, it's over 90%. Omicron variant, it seems the new number of cases have peaked out. So I do expect the things to normalize pretty soon within Japan. Japan, anyway, never had very strict lockdown in all the 2 years. But I hope by summer, the tourists will start to come back to Japan too.
cannot wait to get onto this VTL flight with Japan once it's there. Okay, Cinder, please.
1 minute. Okay. I think the problem with South Asia, the problem with opening up, of course, is that I think a lot of very poor countries are in there, and I think vaccination rates haven't really reached the level that maybe in places like East Asia and Southeast Asia. India, obviously, in a sense, is a strange exception, because I think it's very impressive the rate at which vaccination rates have happened in India, I think, for a country that size. And I think the Indian state is very desperate to open up, because the economic impact that's happened in India is huge. And it's affecting the current government in the state elections that it needs to fight over the next 2 years. Because in India, there's election season nearly every 3 months, right? Because so many states go and all that. So that's my 1 minute. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Last one. Dr. Tess, please.
Okay, so in the Pacific, living with COVID in a number of Pacific Island countries means dying with COVID. So, you know, community's vaccination rate is 3%, and it doesn't seem to be shifting anytime soon. It's very hard to maintain protocols like lockdowns, particularly where people rely on going to the market every day to sell betel nut or bananas in order to make enough money to buy the food to feed the family that day. Lots of households don't have the appropriate cash reserves. Lots of households are overcrowded, so it's not easy to isolate people. So those sort of health protocols that we know of in other countries are very difficult to enforce in a lot of Pacific Island countries. In a country like Tonga, which now has, almost certainly as a result of aid response, now has COVID there are 105,000 people living in Tonga. So basically it means that, you know, if you have more than a couple of dozen deaths, everybody's affected. It's either someone in your immediate family or your extended family or someone that you work with. And that's the reality. And so the community pressure to maintain health and safeguard life for now in a number of Pacific Island countries. Fiji is something of an exception, as is Papua New Guinea, but in other countries such as Vanuatu, for example, and Samoa, the need to preserve life will overcome or will predominate over the need to restore livelihoods. That's not to say that people don't realize the livelihood impacts that it has, but given colonial memory, particularly in places like Samoa and other places, people are much more concerned about keeping everyone alive to the best of their ability. And until we get this vaccine equity issue sorted out, and there are sufficient vaccines of the right sort and the available resources to convert vaccines into vaccinations, it's going to be very hard for some countries to justify opening their borders.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is just, again, a quick reminder how unequal actually this equal access to vaccines really is, right? And how fortunate we are here in Singapore. I speak so flamboyantly about, yay, let us open and please let us travel and so forth. But I really shouldn't mistake a privilege for virtue, right? We're really privileged here, especially in Singapore, where we have like pretty much everyone who could be vaccinated according to health protocol is vaccinated, right? So thank you for this reminder. I really appreciate it. Okay, unfortunately, we are at the end of our webinar today, and I just want to leave you with one thought that I had that is really troubling, has been really troubling me for the past couple of years. Is really that, especially when we study multilateralism in political science and international relations, you often come across this argument, right, that peace and stability here in Asia, but in Europe also, has been really achieved because of this great interconnection that we have, right? People-to-people connectivity, just-in-time supply chains, ever greater exchanges among people, institutionalism, institutionalized multilateral cooperation. So the world, the globalization has brought us so much closer together over the past decades, right? And there's an undoubtable, there's something to be said, undoubtable strong argument that this has at least contributed to the peace and stability that we are accustomed to here in this region for now. And ironically now, COVID-19 is kind of unraveling this, right? And the very reason that a a minor virus perhaps somewhere, and I don't want to say where because we are not entirely sure where it originated, but that this could become a global pandemic affecting literally everyone in the world. Is this very much this interconnection that actually brought so many positive dividends to the world, right? So I hope we don't have to entirely rethink globalization and people-to-people connectivity. And I hope that we can find a way to live with this terrible disease and others that will come in the future, no doubt, somehow without losing this interconnectivity, which we have become accustomed to and which has paid so much positive dividends. So anyway, on this note, I will leave you all. I thank you all, our panelists, for your excellent presentation, for your time in your various time zones. I very much appreciate you letting us in on your thoughts on your respective regions. And to our guests dialing in, thank you very much. And I will make some advertisement for ourselves here next week on Friday, same time, same place, I guess. We will be continuing this webinar, but we will be zooming out, right? We will be going into the world, and we will have speakers for Europe, the Americas, and also a continent that unfortunately is not doing so well in terms of vaccine access either, which is Africa. So something that sometimes here in this region is a bit, I guess, reporting about this continent a bit underdeveloped here. So anyway, thank you very much. And I wish you a fantastic evening, afternoon, wherever you are. And bye-bye from RSIS in Singapore. Adios.